Somebody tell me what year this is right here. I said, who knows what year this is? It's 1984.
The year 1984 was arguably Van Halen at its peak. The band's creativity and tension reached an optimum balance. Enough to keep the passion in the music, but not enough yet to destroy the band. They released their biggest selling album, played their highest grossing tour at the time, ruled MTV, and finally had some prominent music critics give them well-deserved praise. In 1984, they were not only atop the hard rock world, but they had also crossed over to the very profitable mainstream. But behind the stage lights, the band members, producers, and management were splintering rapidly. They had what they had been working so hard for over the past decade, but no one was happy. The wavering buzz from a mountain of cocaine and booze could no longer make up for their internal strife. The backyard party everyone had been invited to was about to get busted, and everyone would need to go home. The build-up to 1984 started in 1981 after coming off their Fair Warning tour. While the band took some time off, Roth suggested they do a cover version of Martha Reeves and the Vandellas Dancing in the Street to keep their name out in public. At the time, Eddie could not figure out how to Van Halenize it, so he suggested Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman. Alex and Roth got behind the idea by constructing an elaborate video that MTV would later ban. The Pretty Woman video required more than the song's 3-minute runtime to execute, so according to Roth, he wrote Intruder on a Mini Moog analog synthesizer, marking the 4th time Van Halen used keyboards on a recording. The first time was for the band's 3rd album, Women and Children First, on the track And the Cradle Will Rock. The other two were on the band's 4th album, Fair Warning, on the tracks Sunday Afternoon in the Park and So This Is Love. To everyone's surprise, the song became a hit, so the top brass at Warner Brothers sent the boys a message via their producer, Ted Templeman, that they needed to make an album quickly. Templeman said, "When you put out a hit single, you better have an album to go behind it, because nobody makes any real money on a single." I'm sure those guys thought by releasing a single and a video, they could temporarily pause the annual album tour cycle they had been on since 1977. But instead, the word came down to me from Mo Austin and Lenny Warnaker that Warner Brothers wanted a new Van Halen album within weeks. Van Halen's management agreed, so the message to the band and me was, "Okay guys, you got a hit, let's get moving, go into the studio." With no time to work on new original tunes, the band padded the album with 5 cover tunes. It took them around 12 days to record Diver Down at Warner Brothers Amigo Studios. The album came out on April 14th, 1982, and would end up selling double their previous album sales with 4 million copies. At the time, Ed defended playing covers to the criticism of critics, but years later he would say Diver Down was the last straw and he'd rather play his own music. He never wanted to be under the gun of Warner Brothers, Ted Templeman, or the man that would end up being his band nemesis, David Lee Roth. He would gain his freedom, like many of us have over the past few years, by working from home. In late April 1982, Ed went to the Roxy Theater to watch and jam with one of the few guitarists he looked up to, Alan Holdsworth. Since Holdsworth was considered a player's player, it was no surprise that Frank Zappa's stunt guitarist, Steve Vai, was also in attendance. Vai gave Ed his number and let him know if he wanted to meet Zappa to give him a call. Ed called Vai, who wasn't home at the time, but he got Zappa's number from Vai's roommate. Ed then called the Zappa household, where Gail Zappa answered and handed the phone over to Frank. In the background, Gail got her son and budding guitarist Dweezil on the extension to see if it really was Edward Van Halen talking with his father. When 12-year-old Dweezil listened, he thought he heard the same guy who says, "Come on, Dave, give me a break," on Van Halen's Unchained, but he was wrong. Later, DeWeasel would learn that the voice in Unchained actually belonged to producer Ted Templeman. According to Eddie, the first thing Frank said to him was, "Thank you very much for reinventing the electric guitar." Within an hour or so later, to DeWeasel's amazement, the current Guitar Player magazine Guitarist of the Year was walking into his home and wearing the same red jumpsuit from Van Halen's Women and Children's first album, and he was carrying a guitar. Frank, wanting to hear more Van Halen, asked Eddie if he would go back home, 5 minutes away, and bring over some of the band's LPs. Eddie complied and returned to play 3 albums for Frank: Fair Warning, Women and Children First, and Diver Down. Loving the music, Frank said to Ed, "I thought you were just another fucking AC/DC. Over the next couple of hours, DeWeasel would watch his father, Eddie, and Vi pass around the guitar and play in Frank's home studio, which was known as the Utility Muffin Research Kitchen. Surprisingly, Frank and Vi, notorious audio recorder hoarders, did not record the session. Later the same year, Frank would say, "Eddie Van Halen is a good guitar player, you know? He's entitled to all the adulations that he can acquire."
Getting tired? No, my fingers got stuck.
Frank wanted to encourage his son's passion for playing the guitar, so he called Ed and asked him if he would produce a song for DeWeasel in Zappa's home studio. At the time, Ed was rehearsing with Van Halen for their upcoming Diver Down tour, but made time for young Zappa. From May to June 1982, Ed and Van Halen's longtime engineer, Don Landy, started working with DeWeasel and his friends on a song called "My Mother's a Space Cadet." DeWeasel and his buddies couldn't really play, but they finished the track with the help of co-songwriter Vi, DeWeasel's sister Moon, and some slide guitar and unison string bending from Eddie. With Van Halen having an unwritten rule not to work outside of the band, Ed and Landy went under the pseudonym of the Vards, a pun on the way Van Halen's mom pronounced his first name, Edward. The rule came into play after Gene Simmons tried to coax Eddie into Kiss. Simmons had financed the band's original 1976 demo tape and unsuccessfully attempted to secure a record deal for the group. But in late 1976, Simmons recruited Eddie and Alex to play on demos for 3 songs: Christine 16, Got Love for Sale, and Tunnel of Love. In the 1995 book Kisstory, Simmons said he liked Eddie's solo on Christine so much that he had guitarist Ace Frehley replicate it for the final Kiss version. In his 1997 book, Crazy from the Heat, David Lee Roth wrote, at that time, he suspected Simmons was absolutely trying to steal Eddie away from Van Halen. Eddie knew of Roth's paranoia, so he kept the Zappa project on the down low.
All right, let me tell you something. I prove to you that I'm bad enough to go to hell.
Yeah!
Because I have been through it.
Yeah!
I have seen it.
Yeah!
It has happened to me.
Yeah!
Remember, I was signed with Warner Brothers for 8 fucking years.
Tell me about it!
After spending a month in Frank Zappa's studio, it was clear to Ed and Landy that Zappa was afforded the luxury of independence with his music, partly due to having his own studio. A place where record labels or budgets set no time limits. A place to experiment without worrying about the cost. A place where a producer would only be allowed in when they wanted him to be there. Engineer Don Landy, who had engineered all of the Van Halen's previous 5 albums, saw eye to eye with Ed's thinking, so they set out to create their own creator safe space.
They'll sell their ass, their cocks and balls, they'll take the check and walk away.
Later in this video, I will highlight some of the darker side of Eddie Van Halen. So it's important to point out here that Eddie could also be one of the nicest, sweetest people you'd know. Here are two small examples with the Zappa family. DeWeasel and his band, Fred Zeppelin, were at school, sound checking, running with the devil for a talent contest. Ed stopped by and DeWeasel told Ed his guitar kept going out of tune. Ed drives home and comes back with a guitar with Floyd Rose's new locking nut system that significantly helped keep guitars in tune. Ed also noticed DeWeasel was playing Running with the Devil incorrectly, so Ed patiently showed him the correct way to play the song. After the gig, Ed told DeWeasel he could keep the guitar.
Frank Zappa, composer, guitarist, free speech advocate, and a unique figure in American music for nearly 30 years, died at his home in Los Angeles last weekend.
The other act of kindness was within an hour after the announcement of Frank's death in 1993, Ed was the first person to call the Zappa household with condolences. Ed was so well liked by the Zappa household that he was their first choice to introduce Frank to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Due to his introversion, Ed turned it down. Ed had the means to have his own home studio, while Landy had the know-how to build it. Technology was not the main factor in choosing equipment. The choices were based on what sounded good and what was available at local parts stores. So one of Landy's first moves was to source out a Bill Putman designed universal audio console for $6,000. Bill Putman is known as the inventor of the modern recording console. Ed said, "We went to take a look at it, and it was this old dilapidated piece of shit that looked like it was ready to go in the trash. Landy got it, and then he wholly rewired it." One of Landy's next moves was to bring in studio designer and longtime work associate Howard Weiss. Weiss brought in a qualified crew of other studio specialists, electricians, builders, and Ed's brother-in-laws, Drew and Pat Bertinelli. While Ed was on tour with Van Halen, Landy, Weiss, and others continued building the new studio at the Van Halen compound. Weiss said, "The deadline we faced required us to work at all hours of the day and night. Valerie Van Halen suggested that club daiquiris were to be consumed in great quantities to maintain the proper state of mind. Don insisted on the continuous viewing of Blazing Saddles while consuming daiquiris."
A man drink like that and he don't eat, he is going to die.
When?
Surrounded by tall trees and barbed wire, the Van Halen home is located in the hills above the San Fernando Valley, north of Los Angeles. A guest house with an unused room sat at one end of the property. Initially, they considered this as a possible control room site, but after some further investigation, they decided it would be best to build the studio from the ground up. Now, zoning laws disallowed building a home studio on your property, so Ed told them it was for a racquetball court and got it approved. The space was divided into two areas, a control room being built 17 feet wide by 14 feet deep with a ceiling height sloping from 12 to 10 feet. The remainder became the studio, measuring 17 feet wide by 23 feet deep, sloping again from 12 to 10 feet. The slab was covered with half-inch particle board and half-inch parquet flooring. 2 feet from the rear of the control room, a wall was constructed to house 3 48-inch high racks of outboard gear with a tape machine. This wall was then carefully tested and found to be bulletproof with a .44 Magnum at 2 feet. Yes, 5150 is literally bulletproof.
Being this is a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, and will blow your head clean off. You gotta ask yourself a question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
Might as well jump!
One unique problem confronting the builder was a 50,000-watt AM radio station just 3 miles from 5150, which could lead to the radio station's broadcast bleeding over when Ed was recording. It was a necessity that Ed be able to play in any location, facing any direction, without hum or noise problems. The solution was building a pseudo chicken coop. Standard chicken wire was used in the walls, flooring, and ceiling to surround the entire recording area. The concept worked flawlessly.
I love it when a plan comes together.
Due to the high heat retention of the exterior walls, a 64-degree inside temperature is maintained, while outdoor temperatures may vary anywhere between 29 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, Ed and Valerie's two-car garage was commandeered to become a shop, tape library, instrument storage, and kitchen. The adjacent guest house also was taken to become the lounge. For any gearheads out there, the text on the screen was the initial studio equipment list. I'll have a link in the description to an article that 5150 studio builder Howard Weiss wrote about building 5150 and where I lifted much of this information. Landy came up with the studio's name, adopting 5150 from the California Welfare and Institution Code for involuntary confinement of a mentally unstable person deemed a danger to themselves and others. Don overheard the code number one night while listening to public broadcast on a scanner, and Ed and Don jokingly called themselves 5150s after many around them said they were crazy to build a studio. Both agreed that 5150 was the perfect name for their new asylum. Once the control room was built and the sound system was ready to be tested, the tape that just happened to be within reach was the DeWeasel tape. My Mother is a Space Cadet would be the first music played in the new 5150 studio, and they were blown away by how good it sounded. Later, the sound of Eddie and Alex playing would waft over to nearby homes in the Hollywood Hills. Eventually, it became too much for Eddie's neighbor, Lindsay Wagner, star of the 70s TV series The Bionic Woman, who would call Eddie's wife, actress Valerie Bertinelli, to ask for the studio doors to be shut. Eddie would have to buy Wagner out of her property within a couple of years to get around the complaints. While Landy and others finished the new home studio, the band continued to fracture at the end of the Diver Down tour. Roth, the outgoing attention seeker, and Eddie, the borderline introvert, were pulling apart the fastest. Despite the growing estrangement, the band completed the tour on February 12, 1983 in Argentina. Ed would go back to his new 5150 studio, Michael Anthony would head back to his wife, who was his high school sweetheart, and Alex Van Halen would rejoin his then-girlfriend, Valerie Kendall, who would become his wife in June of 1983. Roth would head out on another excursion in his adventure crew named the Jungle Studs.